Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Awesome Albums with Awesome Andrew. I hate how I've not been putting out as many episodes as I'd like, but I have a big album I want to talk about today, and I was hoping to release it last year for the album's 50th anniversary, but, well, here we are in 2024. But you already know what this album is if you clicked on this video. We're talking about The Who's 1973 album, Quadrophenia. Before going any further, let's introduce the band. Roger Daltrey, our lead vocalist. John Entwistle, our bass player, but also does horns and even some vocals. Keith Moon, who does drums, percussion, and some vocals. And Pete Townshend, who's credited to everything else. Songwriter, keyboards, guitars, co-lead vocals, cello, banjo, and additional sound effects. We have a lengthy history section for this album, so let's get started. They started working on this album in 1972, which at the time was the least active year for The Who since they formed. They achieved a lot of success on their 1969 album Tommy and their 1971 album Who's Next, which, by the way, I have videos talking about both those albums. If you haven't seen them yet, I definitely encourage you to do that. Anyway, least active year since they formed, and we're struggling to come up with a good follow-up to those two albums. Roger, John, and Keith were all doing their own things during this time. Entwistle released his second solo album, Whistle Rhymes, on November 3rd, 1972, and Roger Daltrey was working on his debut solo album, Daltrey, which was released on May 7th, 1973. Keith Moon was starring in a couple movies, including Frank Zappa's 1971 film 200 Motels as a nun afraid of dying from a drug overdose. He then starred in That'll Be the Day, released in 1973, as a fictional drummer named J.D. Clover. He would later reprise that role in the film sequel called Stardust. The only Who music being made during this era was a mini-opera called Long Live Rock, Rock is Dead, which they collaborated with Glenn Johns in May 1972, but the music was too derivative of Who's Next and the sessions were abandoned, and two more songs, Is It In My Head and Love Reign Over Me, which were eventually released on Quadrophenia. Townshend was inspired by the abandoned Long Live Rock theme, and in autumn 1972 began working on some new material and put out two previously unreleased songs, joined together and relay to keep themselves relevant in the public eye. Otherwise, much of 1972 was spent working on Lou Reisner's orchestral version of Tommy and the before-mentioned solo projects and films. Tensions were high during this time. Daltrey discovered that managers Chris Stamp and Kit Lambert had large sums of money unaccounted for and suggested that they should be fired, which Townshend was against. Townshend felt Lambert in particular was too crucial as a creative manager and worked close with him on this future album's pre-production. While working with Eric Clapton, I was also writing and recording Quadrophenia. Kit Lambert had helped a certain amount while I was writing and had promised to produce the album. He didn't make out very well and argued with Daltrey. I felt let down and took over, despite the fact I had more than enough on my plate, end quote. Tensions got so high that Townshend was hospitalized after Daltrey landed a nasty right hook on him rehearsing for the shows in October 1973, but I'm getting ahead of myself in the story here. Townshend felt frustrated he was unable to produce a film, Tommy, which did get a release in 1975, or Lifehouse, the abandoned album that evolved into Who's Next, and decided to follow Frank Zappa's idea of producing a musical soundtrack that could produce a narrative in the same way as a film. Unlike Tommy, the new work had to be grounded in reality and tell a story of youth and adolescence that the audience could relate to. Pete said, "I've got to get a new act together. People don't really want to sit and listen to our past," end quote. Townshend met with Irish Jack Lyons, one of the original Who fans, which gave him the idea of writing a piece that would look back on the group's history and audience. He created the characters of Jimmy from an amalgamation of 6 early fans of the group, including Lyons, and gave the character a 4-way personality split, which led to the album's title, a play on schizophrenia. Unlike other Who albums, Townshend insisted on composing the entire work, though it deliberately made the initial demos sparse and incomplete so the others could contribute to the finished arrangement. In order to do the album justice in recording Quadrophenia, the group decided to build their own studio, Rampart Studios in Battersea. Work began in November 1972, but 5 months later it still lacked an adequate desk that could handle the recording, so Townshend borrowed his friend Ronnie Lane, bassist for the Faces mobile studio. Lambert began producing the album in May, but missed recording sessions and generally lacked discipline, so Daltrey again demanded that Lambert leave. The band recruited Ron Nevison, who had worked with Townshend's associate John Alcock to help with engineering. According to Nevison, Pete's ARP 2500 synthesizer was impossible to record in the studio, and changing sounds was cumbersome due to lack of patches, which required Townshend to work on these parts at home, working late into the night. And oh yeah, around the same time is when Pete learned how to play the cello. He wanted to get a good string section sound on this album, so he bought a cello and learned how to play it in about 2 weeks, well enough to record at least. During the album's production, Townshend made many field recordings with a portable reel-to-reel recorder. These include waves crashing on a Cornish beach and the Doppler whistle of a diesel train recorded near Townshend's home at Goring-on-Thames. He also began mixing the album in August at home along with Nevison. Quadrophenia was The Who's 6th studio album and the second double album, and was finally released on October 27th in North America and November 2nd in the UK, 1973. but fans found it difficult to find a copy due to a shortage of vinyl caused by the OPEC oil embargo. Pete told Rolling Stone in 1977, when the album was completed, it took only a few days for Roger to express his disgust at the result. I had spent my summer mixing it. Fundamentally, I had taken on too much, as always, and couldn't handle the strain when things went wrong and people blamed me. I felt I was perfectly entitled to gamble and lose, as no one else seemed prepared to, either with Quadrophenia or even The Who's career, end quote. Townsend said something similar later on, saying that Daltrey ended up hating Quadrophenia probably because it had bitten back, end quote. But our story doesn't end here at the release of the album, because, oh man, there was so much that went on the subsequent tour. Townsend wanted to bring on Chris Stainton, who played piano on The Dirty Jobs, 515, and Drowned, as a touring musician, but Daltrey objected and believed The Who's performances should only have the core 4 members. So to achieve the sound, they employed tape backing tracks for live performances like they had already done with Bob O'Reilly and Won't Get Fooled Again. The tour started on October 28th, and the original plan was to play most of the album, but after their first gig, the band dropped The Dirty Jobs, Is It In My Head, and I've Had Enough from the set. Both Daltrey and Townsend felt they had to describe the plot in detail to the audience, which took up valuable time on stage. A few shows later in Newcastle upon Tyne, the backing tapes for 515 came late. Townsend stopped the show, grabbed engineer Bob Pridden, who was controlling the mixing desk, dragged him on stage, shouting obscenities to him, and then walked off. The band returned 20 minutes later, playing older material. Townsend and Moon appeared on local television the following day and attempted to brush things off. The Who played 2 other shows in Newcastle, fortunately without any issues. Other issues on this tour were all the issues with equipment malfunctioning, and also once the tapes start, the band had to play them, which constrained their styles. Moon in particular found playing Quadrophenia difficult, as he was forced to stick to a click track instead of watching the rest of the band. The group had also only 2 days to rehearse before touring. One of those days was abandoned after Daltrey punched Townsend after the argument I mentioned earlier. They began touring in the US on November 20th at the Cal Palace in San Francisco. The group was nervous about playing Quadrophenia after the mishaps they had on the British tour, especially Moon. Before the show, he was offered some tranquilizers from a fan. Just after the show started, the fan collapsed and was hospitalized. Moon's playing started to get erratic, particularly during the end of the show and during Won't Get Fooled Again. He passed out over his drum kit. After a 20-minute wait, Moon reappeared on stage, but during Magic Bus collapsed again and was taken immediately to the hospital. Scott Halpin, a member of the audience, convinced promoter Bill Graham to let him play drums, and the group closed the show with him. Moon had a day to recover, and by the next show at the Los Angeles Forum was playing at his usual strength. The group began to get used to the backing tapes, and the remainder of the gigs were successful. The tour continued into February 1974 with a short series of gigs in France. The final show was the Palais des Sports in Lyon on February 24th. This was also the last time that Quadrophenia was played as a stage piece with Keith Moon, who sadly passed away in 1978. Quadrophenia was revived and brought to the big screen as a movie in 1979, directed by Frank Rodham. The film attempted to portray an accurate version of Townsend's vision of Jimmy and his surroundings, including Phil Daniels as Jimmy and Sting as Aceface. Unlike the Tommy film, the music was largely relegated to the background and was not performed by the cast in the rock opera. The film soundtrack included 3 additional songs written by Townsend, which were Kenny Jones's first recordings as an official member of The Who. The film was a commercial and critical success as it conveniently coincided with the mod revival movement of the late 1970s. In June 1996, Daltrey, Townsend, and Entwistle revived Quadrophenia as a live concert performing at Hyde Park, London as part of the Princess Trust Masters of Music benefit concert, playing most of the album for the first time since 1974. The performance also included Gary Glitter as the Godfather, Phil Daniels as the narrator and Jimmy, Trevor McDonald as the newsreader, Adrian Edmondson as the bellboy, and Stephen Fry as the hotel manager. The musical lineup included Pete's brother Simon, Zach Starkey, Ringo's son, on drums, which by the way was his first appearance with The Who, David Gilmour, who played the bus driver, and Jeff Whitehorn on guitar. John Rabbit Bundrick and John Caron played keyboard, Jody Linscott played percussion, and Billy Nichols led a 2-man, 2-woman backing vocal section and 5 brass players. During rehearsals, Daltrey was struck in the face by Glitter's microphone and performed the concert wearing an eye patch. A subsequent tour of the US and UK followed, employed by most of the same players, but with Billy Idol replacing Edmondson, Simon Townsend replacing Gilmour, and PJ Proby replacing Glitter during the second half of the show. 85,000 fans saw the ensemble at Madison Square Garden over 6 nights in July 1996. A recording from the tour was subsequently released as part of the Tommy and Quadrophenia Live, released in 2005. 1996 was also the year the album was remixed by John Ashley and Andy McPherson. The original version was criticized in particular of Daltrey's vocals being buried, and this 1996 remix would help bring his vocals out a bit more. It was remixed again in 2011 with Bob Pridden. It was a deluxe 5-disc box set. Unlike earlier reissues, this set contains 2 discs of demos including some of the songs that were dropped from the final running order of the album, and a selection of sounds in 5.1 surround sound. The box set came with a 100-page book including an essay by Townsend about the album sessions with photos. At the same time, the standard 2-CD version was re-released with a selection of demos as bonus content. Some Disc 2 tracks were moved to Disc 1 to accommodate these demos. The next revival of Quadrophenia was at the Royal Albert Hall on March 30th, 2010 as part of the Teenage Cancer Trust series of 10 gigs. This one-off performance featured Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder and Kasabian's Tom Megan as guest musicians. In November of 2012, The Who started a US tour of Quadrophenia dubbed Quadrophenia and More. They played the entire album without any guest singers or announcements, with the then regular Who lineup including Starkey on drums and Pino Palladino on bass, who replaced Entwistle following his death in 2002. After Starkey injured his wrist, session drummer Scott DeVowers replaced him for part of the tour with minimal rehearsal. In 2014, the album was released on Blu-ray audio featuring a brand new remix of the album by Townsend and Pridden and 5.1 surround sound, as well as the 2011 Deluxe Edition stereo remix in the original 1973 stereo LP mix. These re-released, remixed, and remastered versions differ slightly from the original 1973 stereo LP mix, as certain vocals, instrumentations, and sound effects have been edited out, most notably the animal sounds midway through The Dirty Jobs. The most recent tour I know of is in September 2017. Townsend embarked on a short tour with Billy Idol, Alfie Boe, and an orchestra entitled Classic Quadrophenia. Ooh, that's a lot of history! Now, I've talked a lot about the album and that there's a story and a concept, but it didn't really explain what the story and concept is. Coming from Pete himself, he said, Quadrophenia tried to describe the utopian secrets of the eternal youth of each Who member. We get our life extensions from our audiences. However far down we go as individuals, there will always be rent to pay, so always an audience. When there's an audience, there's salvation. Mixed up in Quadrophenia was a study of the divine desperation that is at the root of every punk's scream for blood and vengeance. I can elaborate. It is a really fantastic conceit of the part of the establishment to imagine any particular fragment of society is ever the true subject of a rock and roll song. Even in the famous, folk-oriented, political complaining songs of the early 1960s, a thread of upward groping for truth came through strongly. The definition of rock and roll lies here for me. If it screams for truth rather than help, if it commits itself with a courage it can't be sure it really has, if it stands up and admits something is wrong but doesn't insist on blood, then it's rock and roll. We shed our own blood. We don't need to shed anyone else's. End quote from Pete from a 1977 interview with Rolling Stone. Honestly, his statement doesn't really clarify the story if you ask me, so to clarify the story, it's about a working class boy named Jimmy living as a mod in the 1960s. He constantly needs to see a psychiatrist about his split personality. He resents his alcoholic parents and has no desire to go to his job to fund his empty weekend lifestyle. When his girlfriend runs off with his friend, that's the last straw and he leaves home. He smashes up his scooter under a Hammersmith flyover and gets hopped up on Leapers, takes a train to Brighton, where he had his greatest triumph where he and a horde of fellow mods took over a seaside on a bank in 1963. However, when he sees the mod leader, Aceface, working as a bellboy at a hotel he had previously trashed, Jimmy's last illusions about the mod is destroyed. High on pills and gin, he steals a boat and sails out to a rock off the coast. He sits on the rock and realizes that he's 4 separate and entirely different people, quadrophenic. What Jimmy does with this discovery, though, we'll never know. We don't even know if he lives at the end of the story. Now let's move on to the album cover. The album cover is a black and white image of a boy posing on a scooter with a jacket customized with a crudely painted Who logo. The boy was facing away from the camera, while the Who's small faces were reflected in the scooter's mirrors. The front cover design and photography was done by Graham Hughes, with art direction and insert photography by Ethan Russell. Basically, Hughes shot the photo, but the Who faces in the mirror was done by Russell. Apparently it was a pretty divided thing with Pete and Ethan versus Roger and Graham. Graham is Roger's cousin. Fun fact about Russell, though, he is the only photographer to have shot album covers for the British rock trinity of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who, with Russell's photographs of the Beatles used for Let It Be, and his photo being used for the Rolling Stones live album Get Your Ya-Ya's Out, the Rolling Stones in Concert. Russell explains his involvement with Quadrophenia saying, Pete called me up, I was in America, and said, why don't you come on by? I sat down with Pete and said, let's do a book. I think I said 6 pages, but then I showed up with it at 40 pages. I mean, it was that crazy. They were behind schedule. I did the whole book with basically one assistant, and I lost 25 pounds in weight doing that book, end quote. Russell's vision was to take Townsend's storyline about the young mod Jimmy and make it visible, taking his inspiration from gritty, black and white British films such as A Taste of Honey and The Knack, and a love of the work of British photographer Bill Brandt. Russell also said, my idea was to take the 4 faces of the Who, Townsend, Daltrey, John Entwistle, and Keith Moon, and make one face. It's an obvious idea, but what I didn't want it to be, this is the difference, is that I wanted you to not know. I shot the heads on 4x5 and gave it to them, retouchers, to put together. All the time this is going on, it was constantly, what's the cover? I cared about this book like crazy, but they wanted an album cover, and they were right. That didn't happen until we had this big meeting with Pete and Roger where I had stuff from the book and all the rest of that, but it was really about the cover. I got the picture that was made of the four faces of the Who, and you couldn't tell who was who. It really was a new face. He then says, my visceral reaction to it was I think I made a mistake. Since that was all about being a mod, I really did create a mod face like Jimmy, but I just didn't like it. I was freaked out. I brought it to that presentation and Pete looked at it and was interested in it. But I think he took the lead from me that I was scared about it and I wasn't trying to sell it. At that point there were other things that were way too arty and Roger basically took all the props etc. that were part of my doing the book and gave them to Graham Hughes. Graham Hughes had this idea where Jimmy was reflected in the four mirrors and it was a good idea. It did solve the problem in the sense of it didn't have anything else to do with the package. There are a lot of reasons one can feel iffy about it, but it was pretty well done and so I didn't fight it. I went, okay, I had my shot and I didn't deliver. I've since thought about finishing that face. The back cover shows the same scooter abandoned in the water. The gatefold features a shot of the beach looking out into the ocean with the entire story of the album typed up for you. The original 1973 vinyls included that before mentioned book of photos that was predominantly shot by Ethan Russell, which helped illustrate the story of the album, all in monochrome to help match the theme of the album, in the style of the gatefold and the front and back album covers. When the album was released as a 2-CD set in 1985, the lyrics and text storyline were on a thin, fold-up sheet of paper, but none of the photographs were included. The first image you saw of Jimmy riding a scooter down the road with the Battersea Power Station behind him was Pete's favorite image and the one he wanted for the album cover. I have so much more about Quadrophenia that I want to talk about, but since I've made it this far into the video and haven't even mentioned the first song yet, I decided to make the history section its own video. So come back next time for more Quadrophenia where we go through the first half of the story with disc 1 of the album, and then we'll finish off this trilogy with disc 2 and part 3. This has been Awesome Andrew, and I hope to see you guys in another episode of Awesome Albums. See you then.